a Canadian radio sanctuary podcast.
When did you first think of the idea of the Maverick King, Edward II?
Edward II, yeah. I was fascinated with Edward for a while, and I did think about a TV show about him, but then the more I delved into his background and the research, I realized there actually was a good novel in this man. And, you know, when you write a historical novel, one must always keep in mind where and when your protagonist was, or was supposed to be, in those far-off times. It was medieval. For example, in 1322, Edward was waging a war in the Scottish Midlands. That's a known fact. It's also known that Edward had to withdraw his army when thousands of his troops fell victim to disease. Very little has been written about that by the chroniclers of that time. So it was up to me to realize the problems, the conflicts, the obstacles, the resolutions that came about from that particular battle. You see, Edward had, of course, lost Bannockburn. The Battle of Bannockburn was a huge blow to him. It really demoralized him because his father was the famous Longshanks, who was quite the warrior. He never actually defeated the Scots because he was up against Wallace. And so, in a funny way, Edward had to live with, you know, his father's historical warrior background. That was something to live up to. He was not the arrogant despot that his father was. He was a much more reasonable chap, but he had, of course, like everyone else, his failings. And sometimes it's the failings of your protagonist, of your hero, or your anti-hero, and I think he was probably both, that it made him a more interesting character, you know, to write about.
A little bit of the filmmaking combined with writing. And you made a reference one time about Alfred Hitchcock and his thoughts on all that.
Oh, Hitchcock, one of my idols. And in regard to writing, I remember someone asked him, Mr. Hitchcock, what are the three most important things for you in making your wonderful films? Oh, you said three things. There are three things. Well, one would be story, two would be story, and three, story. So that sums up not only, you know, the cleverness of Hitchcock and his wonderful films, but in a sense it sums things up for me as well, because without story you have nothing. But I try to write, as opposed to the non-fiction historical writers, I try to write about the loves and the heartaches, the disappointments, and the agonies of guilt and despair. And those are things, if you like, that happened in the life of Edward. And so that's really good grist for me as a writer. In regard to history, of course, you know, tons of stuff has been written about Edward in non-fiction historical books. But how much of that is really fact? The story of Edward goes back 700 years, a long time to relate history. You know, studies have been done on this, and we know that a story can be related once and then twice, and by the time it gets to the third telling, it has changed. A little bit here, a little bit there, but over 700 years, yes, some of the facts about Edward changed quite radically. He was much maligned as a king. You know, he had fallen out with his barons, or they had fallen out with him. He felt it was up to him to make things right.
We have to understand a little bit of Edward the man. He was unlike any other king in that he had this fascination with working with, to say in quotes, the common people.
That's right. That's right.
Could you elaborate on that a bit?
Well, that's one of the things that fascinated me about Edward, because like no other king, in England anyway, he actually worked shoulder to shoulder with the working people. He donned a workman's apron, he thatched cottages, he fixed bridges, he helped build the foundations of a cathedral. The man had another side to him that was really astonishing for a king. And of course the barons hated this because they wanted their king to be kingly and to do kingly things, and that certainly wasn't a kingly thing to do. But he didn't mind, he didn't care, he got on with it. Because he saw jobs needed to be done, he rolled up his sleeves and he did it. Mm-hmm. And this was fascinated me, of course. I bring some of that into the story.
He was also put in a bit of a bad light by some of the clergy, was he not?
A bad light?
Well, he had some members of the church were his followers, believed in him, loved him, mm-hmm. but he also had those that were working against him sometimes.
Oh, yeah, he had quite a few enemies. But by the same token, as you say, the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Archbishop of York were staunch followers of Edward. And in one case, in the story in the book, the Archbishop of York was responsible for saving his life when he was imprisoned by his queen, Queen Isabella. She was known as the she-wolf of France, for good reason, because she wanted Edward murdered. It's a long story, but she actually managed to defeat him in battle. She got a great number of mercenaries and a huge amount of money to pay for armies. And in fact, she actually was quite popular with many of the English population. And when she put together an army, she found that tons of men were following in her heels. And eventually she beat Edward in battle and imprisoned him. And when he was imprisoned in Berkeley Castle, it looked very bad for him. But Meg, you know, the woman that he was madly in love with for all of his life, she went to the Archbishop of York. And York thought about it, involved two outstanding men who were always great friends of Edward, and they put together 500 silver shekels, went to the prison where Edward was, which was in Berkeley, that's in Gloucestershire, while the owner of the castle there, where he was imprisoned, was away at the time. So he got the castle guard, the captain of the guard, to release Edward for the 500 silver coins. That's how Edward got out. It was no battle or anything like that, but it worked, and that's how Edward actually got away. Now, history tells us no, he was killed there. He was actually killed in prison. But when a letter, a document, which was authenticated, was discovered in the Montpellier archives, it gives chapter and verse of how he escaped, who he escaped with, and where he went. He ended up in Italy. Mm-hmm. This is, I go along with that, because you don't get documents from the Vatican of that time made up by some scribe and giving such intimate details of how he was rescued, where he went, and who looked after him. It was the Fieschi family in Padua. I go along with that side of history, and of course it makes a much more interesting story rather than just being knocked off in prison.
Yes, and Edward and Meg went from England to northern Italy by merchant ship.
Yes, indeed. Again, it was very clever of the Archbishop. The Archbishop had contacts everywhere, of course, and he set up with a merchant shipper in London who was going to Spiezza anyway and Genoa. He spoke to him and he asked him, would you pick up 2 important passengers? Whether he told them it was Edward or not, I don't know. He said, put the ship off somewhere off the coast of Dorset. And in fact, they decided on a specific place and near a specific castle, which is where Edward ended up. Edward and Meg, they ended up there. And so, indeed, after being chased, hounded down by Mortimer's men.
And Mortimer, we should explain, is...
Mortimer was the Queen's lover. He was part and parcel, of course, of her schemes to have Edward murdered, and Meg. They escaped on a dinghy, Edward and Meg, but as they were doing so, the captain of that particular guard, of Mortimer's guard, raced into the waves and threw a spear at the stern of the dinghy and cracked it and smashed it, letting in water, of course. Edward was an outstanding oarsman. That is we know that's documented, and he carried on rowing out towards the big merchant ship that was waiting for them. But halfway there, the boat began to sink, and they both had to swim for it. But they were too far away from the merchant ship, and it looked like very bad news for the two of them. It was very cold water, and of course they had packs with them. But the captain of the merchant ship realized there was a major problem and sent off 2 of his sailors in a dinghy and picked them up. And so they were saved. They, so much trouble and awful circumstances were left behind because no one knew where the heck they had gone. Nobody knew. And the 2 men, of course, who saved them from the Archbishop were vowed to silence. That's another story when they arrived in Italy.
My goodness. I'm always amazed at something that took place back in the 14th century.
Yeah.
How they could communicate with each other so well with no telephones, no internet. It was all letters, wasn't it?
It was all letters. A couple of things on that. Don't forget when Edward escaped after he lost the Battle of Bannockburn, by all rights and circumstances, he should have taken off for the border, back to England. But we know that the 2 roads leading to the borders of England were, of course, pickling with troops, with Scottish troops, and they would have captured him, and there was an enormous ransom on his head. Edward knew this. He sent his cavalry off with his royal ensign flying in the middle, and of course the Scots chased after it in the wrong direction. They tootled off towards the sea. In the meantime, Edward took refuge in Stirling Castle. At least he thought he was taking refuge there, because when he arrived, the great gates were closed to him, and the governor inside the castle said, there's nae place here for the English king. It's your conqueror, our King Robert the Bruce, who will be welcome here. So, my God, he had to move on. And he was still in Scottish territory. So he disguised himself and his 2 compatriots as priests. And he decided to stay in Scotland and flee into the Highlands, which was actually quite a clever thing to do, because there were no armies up there. There was no one to capture him, really. And so off he went as a priest. When he arrived in a little Scottish inn, a little Scottish town called Muckhart, in the inn there he met the love of his life, Meg. And Meg, of course, wanted to join him, and his compatriots said, no, it's much too dangerous. She'll just be a hindrance. They were determined to be together. But, of course, Meg's father, who was a formidable individual, said, absolutely not. You're not going with them. You can't be. I mean, think about it. Married to a priest, what kind of life are you going to have? And he said, there are many men here in the village who would give anything to marry you. No, she said, I'm not interested in any of them. I want to be with Edward. You don't understand our love. And he said, no, you go with them and you'll be called their whore. And that just infuriated her, of course. She stomped out and locked herself in her bedroom. And her mum came in after that from the scullery or the pantry and said, I heard that. You are going way too far. So she is going to be very upset. Oh boy, was she upset. Later on, when they were down in the fields, his father and mother, she packed up, got her best little pony, horse, and took off for the high moors, which would take her in an angle, a tangent, across to the road where Edward was riding towards Perth. Quite a long way. And they do meet up, of course. But there's all kinds of extraordinary, terrible things happen to them on the way. Bearing in mind that one of the things about storytelling is that, you can, first of all, in the beginning of any story, if you like, you have to, I think this is the best way to go. It's the way Hitchcock went. It's the way Dickens went. It's the way, Dostoevsky went. They have an inciting incident at the beginning of their story. Not so much an exciting, but an inciting. And it incites big trouble, huge problems for the protagonist. That's a must. In Edward's case, he was demoralised to be beaten by Robert the Bruce, who had actually a smaller army. But Bruce was the better strategist. And you think, well, why not write about Bruce? Well, I did, in fact. I wrote the first chapter, not this chapter in this book, but I wrote another chapter right at the beginning, and it was all about how fierce the battle was, how clever the strategies were by Bruce, and how, in fact, Bruce was clearly winning. And at the end of writing this, I thought, whoa, wait a minute, stop. You're not writing about Bruce, you're writing about Edward, because Bruce has got everything going from him. Where's the story there? Oh, everything's fine. Everything works out well. Oh, thanks very much. No story. But for Edward, there were serious complications. And it starts by his losing the battle of his life. And when that happens, he has to escape. And that's when I was telling you about how he escaped. But it's interesting because starting with an inciting incident that's very important, that's problematical for the protagonist, is, I believe, how you have to start a good story. You have to present problems, obstacles, conflicts, but you also have to present possibilities of winning as well. You have to write about how he can overcome these difficulties. But it's the problems and difficulties and obstacles that make conflict. And conflict drives a story.
And as you just touched on, you need hope.
You need hope. That's interesting because it kind of involves a psychological attitude. A psychological attitude is great fodder for a writer, particularly emotional disturbances, if you like. And Edward did have emotional problems. Everyone does, you know. His was of a different nature. It was of a kingly nature. Mm-hmm. He had his passions, and his emotions were real. At least they have to be made real. Let's put it that way. Mm-hmm. It's those emotions, psychological events that erupt and that embody his very life that make for good story.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
At least I hope it does. Oh, by the way, I was going to tell you, I just remembered what Stephen King said. He said, I put interesting characters in difficult situations. I write to find out what happens after that. In other words, he said, you've got to have first of all, interesting character, and you put him in a very difficult situation, and then you write about how he gets out of it or what happens to him. You know, you can think of almost any of King's books. That's true. That's how he writes. Mm-hmm, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I love in your book, and you mentioned this earlier, that too much detail at this point of time in an interview to get into all the little subplots. True. What happened with Meg and Edward, their little adventures here and there, and certain unusual people, characters they ran into.
Oh, you're writing 268 pages. You have to put some interesting stuff in there. Otherwise, people will just set it aside.
Yes. Well, I can say that it is very interesting.
Thanks.
It's a beautiful story. I like your reference to, you've said before to me that when you're talking about the chroniclers of these events in history and how many of them, as far as we know, are accurate, and that actually helped Shakespeare later on in his writing of plays.
That's absolutely right. It's very interesting because, history tells us that Edward was murdered in prison in 1327. However, an authenticated papal document, which I mentioned before, explains in great detail, and it's been authenticated, by the way, that he escaped from the Gloucester prison and lived the rest of his life, most of the rest of his life, in Italy. I think it's up to the writer to put flesh and bones of history in terms of historical biases and basis. It's interesting to think that Shakespeare got most of his so-called historical facts from a 16th century historian named Holinshed. Now, Holinshed was a sort of the only guy around who was writing the English history, and amounted to what he had read from much earlier chronicles, to oral history, of course, oral hearsay, he apparently made up. Now, this is where Shakespeare, this is where Shakespeare got the bare bones of his history and the bare bones of his plays. And that's where he got the information. And, it really wasn't all that accurate, let's face it. But Shakespeare's genius lay in the way he was able to create story around complex characters like England's Henry V and Richard II, and how from Holinshed's often dubious histories, he was able to create, of course, the unforgettable characters of Macbeth and King Lear. But it's people think, Oh, was Shakespeare writing the true story about Macbeth? Not really. Was he writing the actual true story about Richard II? Well, he was, of course, writing about certain events and aspects that happened to Richard II, but it's how he fashioned his characters, not fashioned history.
My goodness. I can't say enough about this book. It's wonderful, Alex.
I could go on and on.
I know. Well, you know what? The best thing to do at this stage, I think, is just refer people to the book.
Oh, okay.
And learn the story themselves. But you have filled in so much background on all of this. We thank you for your time today. It's been fascinating hearing your story about your story.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.